Welcome to our second day of the CBI Urban Revival Conference. I'm Lizzie Burden and you're joining me this morning from central London, where we're broadcasting live from the ITN studios. We've got a great lineup of discussions and interviews today, and we want to hear from you too, so there'll be opportunities to put your questions to the panels throughout the day. You can follow @CBI Tweets for updates and join the conversation using the hashtags on the screen now. But first, I am delighted to be joined by Lord Karan Bilimoria, President of the CBI, and Jonathan Wetzel from McKinsey & Company to begin today's conference. Lord Bilimoria, if I can hand over to you now to start proceedings.
Thank you. Good morning, and welcome back to day 2 of the CBI's Urban Revival Conference. When I came to the UK from India in the early 1980s for my further education, Britain was known as the sick man of Europe, and our cities were, quite frankly, pretty run down, with some even down and out. Fast forward to today, and so many of those cities are far more vibrant, happening, and attractive places to live, work, and invest in. London is the greatest of the world's great cities. And whether you go to Birmingham or Manchester, Edinburgh or Cardiff, these are all now truly exciting and thriving cities. In fact, just a few weeks ago, one of Birmingham's most significant public spaces, Chamberlain Square, has reopened as a final part of the first phase of a £700 million paradise scheme at the heart of the city. Joseph Chamberlain, the founder of the University of Birmingham, where I'm proud to be Chancellor, would be very proud. That's urban revival in action, and that's exactly what we're here to talk about today. Look at the future of transport, net zero, cities around the world, and everything in between. And there's rarely been a more important time for this topic. During the pandemic, our formerly vibrant, bustling towns and cities have been under siege, echoing, silent, deserted. And for many businesses and many people, the past 12 months have been harder than at any time in our lifetimes. But now we face a fork in the road. As we emerge from this crisis, do we seize this chance, this duty, to build back our urban spaces and high streets stronger and more resilient than ever before? Or do we carry on in autopilot, hoping for the best? If we choose to act, urban revival must begin with our path out of the lockdown, the roadblock and the road back. It's not going to be easy, but there is now a light at the end of the tunnel, with exit roadmaps giving firms, after a year of uncertainty and stop-start restrictions, that crucial ability to plan. For businesses, that's everything. We also have so many more tools than we did 12 months ago. We have mass testing, we have vaccines, we have repurposed therapeutics and drugs coming online, and we have COVID-secure expertise. And of course, we had the budget, where the Chancellor launched measure after measure to help cushion the landing for firms: an extension to the job retention scheme, a recovery loan scheme, restart grants, extended business rates holidays. Many of these the result of hard-fought CBI campaigns, and I'm grateful to the government for listening to us. Now, we also need a laser focus on helping our high streets, our towns, and our cities to bounce back long term, using every single weapon in our armory to catalyze investment. If there's one policy fix we'd really like to see now, it's for the Treasury, for the Chancellor Rishi Sunak, to deliver on reforming business rates in the autumn. The business rate system is one of our biggest levers for growth, but here in the UK, the burden of property tax is higher than any other country in the G7. It means that when international investors come knocking on our door, they have a reason to invest elsewhere. And crucially, the current system actually disincentivizes investment in the kind of net zero building upgrades that we desperately need, like solar panels or energy efficient heating, holding back our cities, holding back our businesses, and holding back our economy. Now our rate system demands not sticking plaster reforms, but a fundamental rethink. As the foundation of our recovery from this panic and growth into the future, we need this. And of course, COVID has also impacted the way we live and work. With hybrid offices, more home working, less commuting, it could improve the work-life balance for many, and we've heard this yesterday. And we've witnessed a technological earthquake, enhancing our quality of life. But not for all. We face gaps in digital illiteracy, digital poverty, and digital access. So while it seems hybrid working will remain the norm going ahead, we now need to use COVID as a spur to close the digital divide. In November last year, the government went back on its ambition for 100% broadband coverage throughout the UK by 2025 to 85%. Now more than ever, that ambition needs to be reinstated and ensure that the benefits of technology are felt by everyone throughout the country. But as any CEO will tell you, these immediate challenges aren't the whole story. Even before COVID, too many of our brilliant towns and cities here in the UK were already struggling. Globally, more and more of us are moving to live and work in urban areas, pulled by the jobs, the people, the possibilities that they offer. The statistics are stark. In the 1950s, only 750 million people lived in urban centres. In 2018, that number rose to 4.2 billion. In fact, the proportion of the global population living in cities surpassed 50% in 2007, and that's projected to rise to 68% by 2050. It's even one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals to make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. But this trend brings with it uncertainty, extra demand on resources, extra demand on services, on our housing, our transport, our energy systems, pressure on our schools and our hospitals. And while this density has long been our biggest challenge, it's also our biggest strength, forcing us to think afresh, turning our towns and cities into the crucibles of invention. Just look at our history. It was urban growth that led the Romans to create aqueducts, solving the problem of access to fresh water. It was urban growth that led the Victorians to perfect sanitation systems that helped eradicate cholera and typhoid in the UK. We've always faced these pressure points, and we've always overcome them. But today, once again, our society has reached a moment when the triple forces of climate change, advances in technology, and the possibility of another major health crisis all challenge us to reimagine our urban spaces. Because if there's one thing COVID has taught us, it's that we don't know what's around the corner. So now the imperative is on us as businesses not only to adapt to these forces, but to foresee them and to take a lead in shaping our own future, paving the way to healthier, smarter, greener cities, providing the strong transport links, good jobs, vibrant communities that people want. We know there are no quick fixes. It will take collaboration between experts and communities on the ground, but working together with industry and local government, we know that out there are plenty of ideas and lessons we can look to. So this morning, I want to share with you 3 of the big opportunities facing towns and cities to spark our discussions today and to help us reimagine what's possible if we're to make our cities healthier, smarter, and greener. Let me start with the first challenge: making cities healthier. Creating urban spaces allows us to live longer, fuller lives. We all know there are lessons to learn from the past year and how our towns and cities have responded to COVID. And as a commissioner of the University of Oxford Healthy Cities Commission, chaired by my crossbench colleague Lord Best, alongside Kellogg College, Oxford, where I'm proud to be a Bynum Tudor Fellow, and the Prince's Foundation, we're looking at the links between urban design and the risks of disease outbreaks and other serious threats to health and well-being, thinking about what shape urbanization should take in the future, using the World Health Organization's definition of a healthy city. A healthy city is one that is continually creating and improving those physical and social environments and expanding those community resources which enable people to mutually support each other in performing all the functions of life and developing to their maximum potential. That's the definition. And we'll be forming recommendations at every level, at the international level, the national level, city level, neighborhood level, and the individual citizen level. Our work has just started. We'll be aiming to issue a final report and recommendations next year. And I hope it's one of the themes we'll talk about today, throughout the day. The second is smarter cities, using technology and data to make our lives easier. We've seen great examples of this already, like Hull City Council, who a few years ago partnered with Cisco and a connection to make Hull the first smart city in the UK, using data to integrate everything from traffic flows to parking to recycling to street lighting into a single coordinated system. How amazing. But we also know that in some parts of the country, we've got a long way to go. In London, for example, the city ranks, wait for this, 41st in the UK for digital connectivity. And over a quarter of Londoners have an internet speed slower than 30 megabits per second. I mean, that's a huge challenge, but also a huge opportunity for business. To borrow a great example from the country I was born in, just look at India and Prime Minister Modi's plan to create 100 new smart cities, part of a 1.5 trillion global market opportunity. essentially using a network of sensors, cameras, wireless devices, and data centers to improve the delivery of water, electricity, sanitation, education, everything you can imagine. And one of the most ingenious smart solutions is in transport. At the CBI, our commuting research shows that UK drivers lose an average of 178 hours a year just sitting in traffic at a cost of almost £8 billion, an average of £1,300 per driver. And in 2019, 34% of UK carbon dioxide emissions came from transport. It's almost dystopian. In fact, it was the writer Edward Bryant who said, if this were 1890, it would take an inventor to predict the automobile and a visionary to predict highways and gas stations. But it would take a science fiction writer to predict the traffic jam. He was right, of course. But now, smart cities can actually prevent traffic jams with streetlight sensors, road signals, smart meters, providing real-time data, predicting queues, suggesting quicker routes, or helping commuters to switch to public transport, showing when the next bus or train is due, down to the minute. Just imagine if that was possible in every part of the UK, how much time it would save, how much it would add to our economy, and also making the most of our cybersecurity expertise with international smart cities holding great potential for UK businesses to win contracts as well. Finally, I want to talk about greener cities. We know that climate change and the climate emergency demands of us a seismic change. And there are some brilliant urban areas leading the way, tackling pollution, innovating in clean energy, winning the race to net zero. But without action, some cities risk falling behind. The Institute of Urban Strategies ranks London 14th in the world for overall environment quality and 35th for urban cleanliness, well behind cities like Singapore and Tokyo. In fact, as of December 2018, London declared itself in a climate emergency, along with dozens of others from Barnsley to Blackpool. And there are three big components to making our built environment greener: energy, transport, and heating. In energy, we've gone from total dependency on coal 8 years ago to using none for weeks at a time, and innovating in carbon capture and storage, doubling down on efforts as the UK prepares to host the UN's Climate Summit COP26 in Glasgow later this year. There's a way to go, but we're getting there. In transport, manufacturers like Nissan and Jaguar Land Rover are helping us switch to electric vehicles. And there are brilliant towns and cities in the UK already leading, like Aberdeen, the world's first city to have hydrogen double-decker buses. Or Birmingham, where last year Birmingham University's world-leading Centre for Railway Research, a Queen's Award-winning institution, developed the UK's first hydrogen-powered train. A great step showing the ingenuity of universities and business. And at the CBI, we're calling for the government to build more green infrastructure on time and on budget. Projects like Crossrail, projects like HS2, projects like the Northern Powerhouse Rail, helping us get around while meeting our net zero ambition. Finally, in heating, I'm very proud of the CBI's work with the Heat Commission, which I was proud to chair alongside the University of Birmingham, to help decarbonize UK homes and businesses. We know that heat makes up over 1/3 of carbon emissions. Over half of that comes from buildings. But tackling this isn't only about what we build in the future. In fact, new buildings add only 1% per year to the nation's 29 million homes. Rather, it's about regeneration and retrofitting using, for example, heat pumps, hydrogen, and community heating. Investment in energy efficiency, not just for net zero, but also as a way to tackle fundamental aspects of poverty and inequality while reducing NHS and social care costs. All these innovations at scale could make a real difference. So those are just three ambitions: healthier, smarter, greener urban spaces. And of course, this is not going to be easy. It can't be done by business alone. But sometimes we just forget how much of a difference enterprise and business can make. Just look back in history. I always say the best way to predict the future is look at the past. Look at the amazing townships of the early 20th century. Cadbury's Bourneville, Rowntree's New Erswick, Leverhume's Port Sunlight, or more recently, the Duchy of Cornwall's Poundbury, the Prince of Wales's project. And in India, the city of Jamshedpur, created by the Tatars around India's first steel factory. Entire communities formed around business with companies that really looked after their workers and their families, and valuing not just functionality, but the aesthetics of a built environment, gardens and beautiful public places, and harmonious design, homes that inspire people and don't diminish them. These should all be inspiration to us. Finally, I just want to acknowledge that urban revival is not a simple process. I think it's important to take a totally holistic view of how we understand our towns and cities, not just thinking about our physical spaces, for things like diversity, mental and physical well-being, access to open space, access to culture, our aging population, social care, pollution, design, postcode inequality, deprivation, income poverty, resilience. These are all issues to consider. And there's a fantastic report by the Quality of Life Foundation about how to measure the success of our cities, not only in economic value or GDP, but things like nature, wonder, movement, and belonging. A capacity for playfulness, imagination, community, and building a strong sense of place. That's what I'd like to end on, remembering the real value of our cities. That's what I hope we can achieve together. And I hope that you have a brilliant conference. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Lord Bilimoria. Always such a pleasure to hear from you. And we'll be seeing you later in our session on lessons from around the world. Now, we're also fortunate to hear from Jonathan Wetzel from McKinsey & Company, who's joining us today from China to talk about climate change and the importance of a just and inclusive transition to net zero. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you so much. And it's a real pleasure, and I'm inspired by the words of Lord Bilimoria, really a sense of place and a sense of heart in the city. And that's what I would like to address my remarks to, specifically in the context of the net zero transition. So this is a very specific topic in that sense, that cities and climate inextricably intertwined. Cities are, of course, the heartbeat of our climate in more ways than one. They generate the demand for goods and services that is fundamentally changing our climate. They are the source and the demand for most carbon emissions. But with that, they are also, of course, the place where we see the impacts of the changing climate most evidently, whether it's the floods or the droughts or heat waves. Cities are where the crises strike. They are at the center of our systems of infrastructure, of food delivery, of technology development. So just to give one or two sort of indications of where we are, of course, last year was the first year where we had more than $20 billion events in the United States due to natural climate disasters. So clearly a marker of something. And as we looked at this in our research going forward in an unconstrained scenario, the RCP 8.5, as they say, this will increasingly put existential threat to our cities. By the year 2050, we would estimate that somewhere approximately 1 billion people might live in a region which would experience a heat wave on a 14% annual probability. So almost 1 billion people, 14% probability every year of experiencing a heat wave, a climate that we have never seen before, and we cannot see it. We cannot see it. So how will we address this? So there is, I think, the nub of it and the opportunity, because what we see is the transition is actually something we can do, that this is not magic. It is achievable. The 1.5 degree scenario or net zero, which is where we have to go if we are not going to continue to heat up the planet, relies mainly on known technology. Are mostly commercialized, some areas for development, but mostly known. And it is actually very clear, as Lord Bilimoria spoke to. We have 5 sectors in one sink. We have the buildings, we have the mobility, we have the power systems, we have industrials, we have land use, and finally we have nature. All of these things need to be considered together, but they are doable. They do represent a known path. The challenge is that this path involves all of us. There is not a sector, there is not a job, there is not a geography which will be unaffected by this transition. This transition affects, first of all, the majority of our jobs. Over 50% of jobs are in sectors that account for 85% of emissions. It affects GDP. It affects capital investments. And roughly how much, you ask? It affects it all by about 20%. Now, that doesn't sound like a big number, but these are very big numbers. If we look at the global capital expenditures that would be needed in the transition over the next 30 years, it's approximately $250 trillion, an enormous, perhaps unthinkable number, except one could basically say this is approximately 20% higher than what it would have been without the transition. And then on top of that, there is a bit of reallocation of capital. And this capital is going to achieving a more resilient, a more sustainable city, a more sustainable power supply, a more sustainable mobility system. And that will pay off. That will pay off in a reduction in prices and costs as that resilience merits. And that we think is the opportunity here, but it recognizes that these systems, these investments, they are front loaded. They are not free. They do require us to mobilize and to act. And at the end of the day, you say, well, 20%, maybe that doesn't amount to much. And these colossal numbers across the global economy, 20%, maybe that's doable. Well, the thing is, of course, that is not 20% for everybody. We have to address the fact that this is not an equally shared burden. The burden of the transition will fall to the vulnerable communities the hardest, whether that be low income, whether that be low income communities, low income populations and geographies, specific sectors. These are the areas that we have to watch out for in order to enable that transition. We must mitigate the risk on those communities, or this transition will not happen. To give some sense, there are 26 US counties which have over 10% of their jobs in high fossil environments. We have low-income countries, including India and others, which face the double whammy of not only having a fossil-intensive economy, but also facing increasing physical climate risks. And of course, we have the risks associated with isolated communities if they cannot change and they cannot reskill themselves, communities that have been grown up around steel mills or coal mining. These communities do have opportunities, and there are many opportunities. We believe that there will be over 100 million jobs created by the transition, jobs in renewable energy, jobs in electric vehicles. But these communities, these opportunities, they are contestable. They face the winds of global competition. And in order for us to enable the transition, we also have to enable those jobs. We need to support the technologies. We need to support the human capital that it will take to compete for those jobs. That is the opportunity, but that's also the challenge. So what can cities do, and how will they do it to enable a just and inclusive transition? We think that there are four things to consider. The first is to recognize the impacts. Recognize the impacts through data of the transition. We need to incorporate transition risk as well as physical risk into our assessments of everything, whether it is a lending decision, or it is a stock purchase, or it is an operation of a factory or of a shop. Understanding the impact that you are having, understanding the risk that you face from your asset no longer being economic, from your savings no longer being there, that is a critical first step. What is not measured is not managed. And so incorporating and creating transparency around the data for cities is the first important element of this transition. The second is we need to crowd in capital. It is going to take a lot of effort to make the transition happen, but it can happen, and there are returns to it. Public capital will not be enough. We will need private capital to accelerate technology development and to reallocate capital across the systems of power, of buildings, of mobility. New capital will be needed in order to support new technologies. Constructing models where we can recognize and value the externality of mitigating climate change is critical to enabling that capital to flow and to come into those new technologies, and to support the vulnerable communities, to enable those communities to participate. So crowding in private capital, whether it is through public-private partnerships, through impact investing, through, importantly, risk mitigation, risk-sharing arrangements, reinsurance. We said one idea that I like a lot is the idea of a MIGA for climate risk, a multilateral insurance guarantee agency for climate risk, to enable those communities that cannot raise capital to mitigate climate, to mitigate their risk through guarantees. This is something which I would encourage the wealthier communities to think about. So that's the second part, crowding in capital, and every city can do this. Every city can enable those arrangements. Thirdly, reskilling and community development. It may go without saying, but we face a crisis of learning, that we have historically dedicated the vast majority of our funds dedicated to learning until people who are the ages of approximately 25. That's no longer good enough. We will need to find ways to incorporate the vast majority, in fact, all of us, in a lifelong learning journey. That journey has to be done in the workplace. So ultimately, it is the responsibility of employers to take up the burden of rethinking their employment contracts, of how they are working together with their communities to enable those people to become more resilient, to embrace those new technological capabilities, and to deploy them in sustainability. So all of this is also, again, of course, ultimately a local capability, and cities need to take up that challenge. Working together with educators, with employers, with civil society, they can and will reskill communities to develop. So finally, the last point I would want to stress is that, of course, cities cannot do this alone, that there is in any governance structure a multi-level subsidiarity challenge. Who will you work with if you are a city? Will you work with yourselves, with subunits and boroughs? Will you work up towards regions? Will you work at the federal level? Sorting that out and creating accountability at the lowest level possible in order to achieve the transition will be critical to not only identifying the problems, but delivering the solutions. So creating the institutions to enable that data, that funding, and that talent to be redeployed and developed will be a critical organizational challenge for cities. Lord Bilimoria concluded with a poetic note, which I cannot hope to aspire to, but I do stress one thing, that cities are our lifeblood. Cities are who we are. We are the species that build cities. Climate is the existential challenge to that life. By addressing that challenge, we will not only survive, but we can prosper and thrive. Thank you so much.
Thank you to both Jonathan Wetzel and Lord Bilimoria, of course, for your insights. Next, we'll be discussing future transport patterns.